October 12th, 1492. A sailor on a Spanish ship spots land after 36 days crossing an unknown ocean. Christopher Columbus steps onto a Caribbean beach, believing he has reached Asia, and claims the territory for Spain. This moment will change world history more profoundly than perhaps any other single event. It connects two hemispheres that had been separate for millennia, triggers the largest demographic catastrophe in human history, and launches the age of European global dominance. Columbus will make 4 voyages to the New World, establish colonies, discover gold, and become Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of the Indies, with the right to 10% of all wealth generated in his territories. He should have died one of the richest and most honored men in history. Instead, he will spend his final years battling the Spanish crown in court, stripped of his titles and privileges, his reputation destroyed, his health broken. And he will die in 1506, not wealthy and celebrated, but in relative obscurity, still believing he had reached Asia, never understanding that he had stumbled onto continents unknown to Europeans. This is the story of Christopher Columbus, the man whose ambition changed the world, but whose greed, incompetence, and brutality destroyed his own legacy. This is about discovery, exploitation, genocide, and the price of arrogance. The man who connected worlds but ended in chains. Christopher Columbus was born Cristoforo Colombo in Genoa, Italy, probably in 1451, into a family of wool weavers. His background was comfortable middle class, but Columbus had grander ambitions. From his youth, he was drawn to the sea, eventually becoming an experienced sailor and navigator. By his 30s, Columbus was living in Portugal, working as a merchant sailor and mapmaker, and developing the idea that would define his life. Columbus's plan was based on a fundamental miscalculation. He believed that the Earth was smaller than it actually is, and that Asia extended much farther east than it does. Combining these errors, Columbus calculated that Japan lay only about 2,400 miles west of the Canary Islands, a voyage of a few weeks across the Atlantic. In reality, the distance is over 10,000 miles. Columbus was spectacularly wrong, but his error would lead to the most consequential voyage in history. The educated scholars of Columbus's time knew the Earth was round and had reasonably accurate estimates of its size. When Columbus proposed his plan to reach Asia by sailing west, experts correctly told him his calculations were wrong and the voyage was impossible. No ship could carry enough supplies for the actual distance to Asia. But Columbus was convinced he was right, and the experts were wrong. His absolute certainty in the face of contrary evidence was both his greatest strength and his fatal flaw. Columbus spent years trying to convince European monarchs to finance his expedition. He approached King John II of Portugal, who consulted his advisors. They correctly told the king that Columbus's calculations were wrong and rejected the proposal. Columbus then approached Spain, which was completing the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to expel Muslim rulers from the Iberian Peninsula. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand were interested, but needed time to finish the Granada campaign. Columbus waited years, growing increasingly desperate. He was approaching 40, middle-aged by medieval standards, and his chance was slipping away. He made extravagant demands. He wanted noble titles, the right to govern any lands he discovered, and 10% of all wealth generated. Most monarchs would have laughed at such demands from a foreign merchant sailor. But in 1492, with Granada finally conquered and Spain flush with victory, Isabella agreed to Columbus's terms. She would finance his expedition in exchange for the potential wealth of Asian trade. On August 3rd, 1492, Columbus departed from Palos, Spain, with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. The crew totaled about 90 men, most of them Spanish sailors. Columbus commanded the Santa Maria. The ships were relatively small, designed for coastal sailing rather than ocean crossing, but they were well supplied and well maintained. Columbus stopped at the Canary Islands for final provisions. Then on September 6th, he turned west into the unknown. The voyage was terrifying for the crew. They sailed day after day with no land in sight, further from home than Europeans had ever deliberately traveled. The crew grew increasingly anxious, fearing they would never find land or be able to return. Columbus used a combination of authority, deception, and promises to keep them sailing west. He kept two logs, one showing the true distance traveled, which he kept secret, and a false log showing shorter distances, which he shared with the crew to prevent panic. By early October, the crew was near mutiny. They had sailed far beyond the point where Columbus had promised they would reach land. Supplies were adequate, but not unlimited. The psychological strain was enormous. Columbus promised the crew that if they didn't sight land within 3 more days, they would turn back. It was a promise that saved the voyage because just hours before the deadline, on October 12, 1492, a lookout on the Pinta spotted land. Columbus landed on an island in the Bahamas, which he named San Salvador. The indigenous people, the Taino, came to the beach to greet these strange visitors. Columbus described them as very well-formed people with handsome bodies and very fine faces. The Taino were friendly, curious, and generous, offering gifts of food, water, and goods to the strange pale men who had arrived in enormous ships. Columbus's reaction to these friendly people was immediate and revealing. In his journal, he wrote, "They ought to make good and skilled servants, for they repeat very quickly whatever we say to them. I think they can easily be made Christians, for they seem to have no religion. If it pleases our Lord, I will take 6 of them to your highnesses when I depart, in order that they may learn our language." Within hours of first contact, Columbus was already thinking of the Taino as potential slaves and planning their conversion and subjugation. Columbus also noticed that some Taino wore small gold ornaments. When he asked where the gold came from, they pointed south and west. This became Columbus's obsession, finding the source of gold. He believed he was near Japan or China, and he expected to find the fabulous wealth Marco Polo had described. Columbus spent the next 3 months island hopping through the Caribbean, searching for gold and the Asian mainland he believed was nearby. On Christmas Day, 1492, the Santa Maria ran aground on the coast of Hispaniola, modern Haiti and Dominican Republic, and was wrecked beyond repair. Columbus established a small settlement called La Navidad, leaving about 40 men there with instructions to search for gold. He took the Niña and Pinta and began the return voyage to Spain, bringing with him several kidnapped Taino people, gold samples, exotic plants and animals, and tales of wealthy lands ready for exploitation. Columbus arrived back in Spain in March 1493 to a hero's welcome. He had accomplished what no European had done, crossed the ocean sea, and returned. He brought physical evidence of new lands and peoples. He claimed to have reached Asia, or at least islands near Asia. Isabella and Ferdinand received him with honor, confirmed his titles, and began planning a much larger expedition to establish permanent Spanish presence in these new territories. The second voyage in 1493 was vastly larger, 17 ships and over 1,200 men, including soldiers, farmers, craftsmen, and priests. The goal was colonization and conversion, not just exploration. Columbus returned to Hispaniola to find La Navidad destroyed and all the men he had left there dead, killed by the Taino after the Spanish had raped women and stolen gold. The friendly welcome had turned into violent resistance once the Taino understood what these strangers actually wanted. Columbus established a new settlement, Isabella, and began systematic exploitation of Hispaniola. He organized expeditions to search for gold. He established a tribute system requiring every Taino person over 14 years old to deliver a hawk's bell full of gold dust every 3 months. Those who delivered gold received a copper token to wear around their necks as proof. Those who failed to deliver gold had their hands cut off and were left to bleed to death. This was the beginning of the genocide of the Taino people. The gold quota was impossible for most Taino to meet because Hispaniola didn't actually have large gold deposits. Columbus had vastly overestimated the gold wealth based on the small ornaments he had seen. As Taino people failed to deliver gold, Columbus's men punished them brutally. Entire villages were enslaved. People were forced to work in mines or on plantations. Women were raped systematically. Children were kidnapped and sold. The violence was extraordinary, even by the standards of the time. Columbus's administration of Hispaniola was catastrophic. He was an experienced sailor and navigator, but had no experience or talent for governing. The colony descended into chaos, corruption, and violence. Spanish colonists fought among themselves over gold and enslaved labor. Columbus and his brothers, whom he had appointed to positions of authority, ruled through terror and brutality, punishing both indigenous people and Spanish colonists who challenged their authority. Spanish settlers began complaining to the crown about Columbus's mismanagement. They reported that Columbus was keeping wealth for himself and his family, that he was denying other Spaniards their rightful shares, and that his brutality toward both the indigenous population and Spanish colonists was excessive. Columbus responded to dissent among Spanish colonists by having them hanged, tortured, or mutilated. He ruled as a dictator, tolerating no opposition. The indigenous population of Hispaniola collapsed under Spanish rule. Disease was the primary killer. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other European diseases to which the Taino had no immunity swept through the population. But Spanish violence, overwork, starvation resulting from the disruption of indigenous agriculture, and outright massacre also killed enormous numbers. The Taino population of Hispaniola, estimated at 250,000 to 300,000 when Columbus arrived in 1492, had collapsed to perhaps 60,000 by 1508. By 1548, the indigenous population was effectively extinct. Columbus made 2 more voyages to the New World in 1498 and 1502. The third voyage took him to the South American mainland for the first time, where he explored the Orinoco River Delta in modern Venezuela. He still believed he was near Asia, interpreting every geographic feature through the lens of his obsession. When he encountered the massive flow of freshwater from the Orinoco, he briefly wondered if he had found the biblical Garden of Eden, demonstrating how religious conviction and geographic confusion mixed in his mind. But Columbus's position was deteriorating. The Spanish crown had grown alarmed at the reports of mismanagement and brutality. In 1500, Isabella and Ferdinand sent Francisco de Bobadilla as a royal commissioner to investigate conditions in Hispaniola. Bobadilla arrived to find chaos, Spanish colonists in rebellion, indigenous people being slaughtered, and Columbus ruling as a tyrant. Bobadilla arrested Columbus and his brothers, clapped them in chains, and sent them back to Spain. The image of Columbus, the Admiral of the Ocean Sea, Viceroy, and Governor of the Indies, being shipped back to Spain in chains was shocking. The captain of the ship offered to remove the chains during the voyage, but Columbus refused, insisting on wearing them as a symbol of the injustice done to him. He kept the chains for the rest of his life, reportedly requesting to be buried with them as evidence of how he had been treated. In Spain, Isabella and Ferdinand released Columbus from prison, but stripped him of his governorship of Hispaniola. They allowed him to keep his other titles and granted him wealth, but his political authority over the colonies was gone forever. Columbus spent years petitioning the crown to restore his full rights and privileges, claiming he had been unjustly treated. He seemed genuinely unable to understand that his brutal mismanagement had been the problem. Columbus's fourth and final voyage in 1502 to 1504 was a desperate attempt to restore his reputation and find the wealth he had promised. He explored the coast of Central America, still searching for a passage to the Indian Ocean he believed was just beyond. He found nothing but hostile indigenous populations, more disease among his crew, and continuous bad weather. His ships were worm-eaten and barely seaworthy. The expedition ended in disaster when Columbus and his crew were stranded for a year in Jamaica before being rescued. What makes Columbus's story particularly tragic is that even after 4 voyages and years of exploration, he never understood what he had discovered. He died believing he had reached Asia, or islands near Asia, never grasping that he had stumbled onto continents unknown to Europeans. This fundamental misunderstanding shaped all his decisions and contributed to his ultimate failure. Columbus's geographical confusion was profound. When he encountered the South American mainland, with its enormous rivers and continental scope, he rationalized it as part of Asia. When he sailed along Central America's coast and found no passage to the Indian Ocean, he convinced himself that the passage was just a bit further. When indigenous people told him about an ocean on the other side of the Panama Isthmus, the Pacific, he misinterpreted this as confirmation he was near the Indian Ocean. This confusion had practical consequences. Columbus kept promising the Spanish crown that he was on the verge of reaching the wealthy Asian kingdoms Marco Polo had described. When these kingdoms never materialized, when the gold he found was minimal, when the spices he expected to find didn't exist, the crown grew skeptical. Columbus had promised a route to Asian wealth. What he delivered was islands with some gold, hostile populations, and continuous administrative disasters. Other explorers were beginning to understand what Columbus couldn't accept. Amerigo Vespucci, sailing for Portugal and Spain in the early 1500s, explored the South American coast and concluded that this was a new world, not Asia. His name would eventually be given to the continents, America. When Europeans finally understood that Columbus had discovered not a route to Asia, but entirely new continents, Columbus was already dead and unable to claim credit for the true magnitude of his discovery. Columbus's religious fervor also deepened in his later years, becoming increasingly mystical and apocalyptic. He wrote the Book of Prophecies, a compilation of biblical passages and religious texts that he interpreted as predicting his voyages and role in Christian salvation history. He saw himself as God's chosen instrument, destined to find gold that would finance a new crusade to recapture Jerusalem. This messianic self-image made it impossible for him to accept that he had been wrong about geography or that his governance had been disastrous. The Spanish crown had moved on from Columbus by the early 1500s. Other explorers were discovering and claiming territories throughout the Caribbean and mainland Americas. The Spanish colonial system was being established by administrators more competent than Columbus. The wealth beginning to flow from the New World came from silver mines, plantation agriculture, and systematic exploitation of indigenous labor, organized by people other than Columbus. Columbus spent his final years in Spain, increasingly ill with arthritis and other ailments, obsessed with his legal battles to restore his privileges. He believed he had been cheated of his rightful due, that the Spanish crown owed him far more than they had given him. He demanded 10% of all wealth from the Indies, as his original contract specified. He wanted his titles and governorship restored. He wanted recognition as the man who had opened the New World to Spain. Christopher Columbus died on May 20th, 1506, in Valladolid, Spain. He was about 54 years old, sick, bitter, and still embroiled in legal disputes with the Spanish crown. Contrary to popular myth, he didn't die in poverty or complete obscurity. He had wealth, income from his discoveries, and servants. But compared to what he had been promised and what he believed he deserved, his circumstances seemed diminished. He died a disappointed man, convinced he had been robbed of glory and fortune. Columbus was buried initially in Valladolid, then moved to Seville. His remains were later allegedly moved to Santo Domingo in Hispaniola, then to Havana, Cuba, then back to Seville. The exact location of Columbus's remains is disputed, with both Seville and Santo Domingo claiming to possess them. Even in death, Columbus's identity and legacy remain contested. Columbus's family continued the legal battles for decades after his death. His son Diego eventually won some concessions from the Spanish crown, including the title of Admiral of the Indies and some financial compensation. But the family never recovered the full rights Columbus had been granted in 1492. The Spanish crown had learned that giving foreigners hereditary control over vast territories and enormous percentages of wealth was dangerous and foolish. The immediate aftermath of Columbus's voyages was catastrophic for indigenous Americans. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and people between the Old World and New World transformed both hemispheres. But the impact was asymmetrical. Europe gained enormous wealth, new crops like potatoes and corn that would transform European agriculture, and vast new territories to colonize. The Americas gained diseases that killed up to 90% of the indigenous population within a century, conquest that destroyed indigenous political systems, and exploitation that reduced survivors to slavery or serfdom. The demographic catastrophe of indigenous American depopulation is difficult to comprehend. Pre-Columbian population estimates vary widely, but reasonable estimates suggest 50 to 100 million indigenous people lived in the Americas in 1492. By 1600, perhaps 90% were dead, mostly from disease but also from violence, overwork, and social disruption. This is the largest demographic catastrophe in recorded history, killing more people than any war, famine, or pandemic before or since. Columbus's personal responsibility for this catastrophe is complicated. He didn't intentionally spread disease. Nobody in 1492 understood how diseases were transmitted. But his policies of enslavement, overwork, and systematic violence directly killed tens of thousands. His establishment of the tribute system and forced labor created conditions where disease spread more easily and people couldn't maintain their health. His brutality set precedents that later conquistadors would follow and exceed. For centuries after his death, Columbus was celebrated as a hero who had opened the New World to European civilization. His voyages were portrayed as the beginning of progress, spreading Christianity and European culture to benighted lands. Columbus Day became a holiday in many countries, celebrating his discovery of America, even though millions of people were already living there and Vikings had reached North America centuries earlier. This heroic narrative began to crack in the late 20th century as historians examined the consequences of Columbus's voyages more critically. The indigenous perspective, long ignored in histories written by descendants of European colonizers, finally received attention. Scholars documented the scale of demographic catastrophe, the brutality of early Spanish colonization, and Columbus's personal role in establishing systems of exploitation and genocide. Indigenous activists in the Americas began challenging Columbus Day celebrations, arguing that honoring Columbus was celebrating genocide. They proposed alternatives, Indigenous Peoples Day, recognizing the communities that existed before Columbus. Some cities and states adopted these alternative commemorations. Columbus statues have been vandalized or removed in various locations. The once unquestioned hero has become a deeply controversial figure. Defenders of Columbus argue that judging him by modern standards is unfair, that he was a man of his time, that his actions were normal for the late 15th century. They point out that Columbus enabled the creation of modern American nations and cultures, that the Columbian Exchange ultimately benefited humanity despite its terrible costs, and that completely condemning historical figures leaves no one to celebrate. Critics respond that even by the standards of his own time, Columbus was notably brutal and incompetent. His contemporaries, including Spanish colonists and officials, complained about his violence and mismanagement. The Spanish crown found his governance so unacceptable that they arrested and stripped him of authority. Columbus wasn't just a man of his time. He was extreme even for his brutal era. The story of Christopher Columbus is ultimately about the gap between what someone intends and what they actually accomplish, between dreams and consequences. Columbus dreamed of reaching Asia, finding gold, and winning glory. He accomplished none of these goals. But through his failures and mistakes, he changed the world more profoundly than most people who succeed. Columbus never reached Asia. He found something far more significant: 2 continents, 2 enormous landmasses with hundreds of millions of acres of land, vast natural resources, and millions of indigenous people whose societies, cultures, and lives would be transformed or destroyed by European contact. Columbus's mistake, his fundamental misunderstanding of geography, led to the greatest geographic discovery in recorded history. Columbus never found the golden kingdoms he sought. The gold in the Caribbean was minimal. The real wealth of the Americas would come from silver mines in Peru and Mexico, plantation agriculture producing sugar, tobacco, and cotton, and land itself. But Columbus's claims about gold initiated the process that would bring Spain enormous wealth, making it Europe's dominant power for over a century. Columbus never won lasting glory from the Spanish crown. He died stripped of his governorship, his privileges contested, his legacy uncertain. But he gave Spain the New World, or at least started the process of Spanish colonization that would create a vast empire. Whether Spain benefited from this empire in the long term is debatable. The flood of American silver may have actually damaged the Spanish economy. But there's no doubt that Columbus's voyages made Spain a global power. Columbus's personal tragedy was that he understood none of this. He died believing he had reached Asia, convinced he had been cheated of his rightful rewards, unable to comprehend the true magnitude and consequences of what he had done. In a way, Columbus was the least qualified person to judge his own legacy because he fundamentally misunderstood what he had accomplished. It was a complicated story of Christopher Columbus. If you enjoyed my video, please like and subscribe. It will help me a lot to expand my channel.